Hi, I'm Malessa.
And I'm Candice.
Welcome to The Build Up, where we discuss the secrets of building wealth through real estate.
Today, we're going to be discussing ESG and real estate and talking with TV chef and published author Priyanka Naik on her home ownership journey.
Did you know that real estate is the largest carbon emitter on Earth?
Honestly, before we really started even researching this, I had no idea that it was, but I mean, it's a little bit scary.
Exactly. So decarbonization in real estate has a potential of a huge impact, right? Because it is the largest contributor. And it's been really great to see that companies are taking a positive step forward to try to, help with this.
Right. I mean, it's definitely, a runaway train at this point. So finally, we're starting to see some companies step in and make some positive changes. We saw Blackstone and also Microsoft are implementing some initiatives to really reduce their carbon footprint. For example, Blackstone has actually committed to reducing their emissions by 15% within the next 2 years across their entire real estate portfolio. And they're also implementing new initiatives and new technologies to have a better design and materials used in their buildings as well.
Exactly. And Microsoft also, they are looking to be carbon negative by 2030. And they, like you mentioned, they are really putting in a lot of money, I think $1 billion in their climate innovation fund to really start implementing really positive change, right? For example, they're looking to build innovative technology for materials and buildings.
Yeah, it's around a lot of companies are looking at this, but not just large companies. Also, real estate developers are now feeling a lot of pressure from, the end resident, whether they're the tenant or the buyer, who are seeking more sustainable products and materials used in the buildings, which is actually an attractant to them, to certain buildings over others. And so because of that demand, now we're seeing developers are starting to build in a more sustainable way, which is obviously very positive.
Exactly. And like we are going to be discussing later with Chef Priyanka, it's really people like her who are looking for more sustainability, right? And they're not going to buy into your building if you don't have some sort of component, right? So it's very important, but it's also nice to see that these companies are taking notice of what's going on. But, also how are they being accountable? Because these companies are all trying to be better and trying to be more sustainable, but how are they tracking that, right? Because there are a lot of incentives for companies who are being more sustainable. So, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, they developed this framework and metric for tracking these, right? So to track buildings who are actually being sustainable.
Right, because like you said, they're seeking incentives. And so if they're going to be qualifying for that, there needs to be a way to see your performance of how are you actually making positive change. And so there's a number of, alternative capital that developers and investors can use if they're going to choose to make this commitment to ESG. And it's called green financing. And one of the forms of green financing is called PACE, which stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And this is repaid through a special assessment added to the property's tax bill. And the financing actually stays with the property even after it's sold. So it's a more long-term benefit that can be added. And also through green financing, a lot of times there's more favorable terms than with traditional financing. And so you can benefit obviously not only from tax breaks, but also lower interest rates, which I feel like every week we're talking about how high interest rates are. And so developers also can benefit from the lower interest rates through these programs.
Exactly. And as you know, there is really a supply shortage currently. So definitely it's really important that they're getting these incentives. So it'll just incentivize them to build more. And so we need more housing. That's
bottom line.
Exactly.
But this is a huge topic. It needs to be addressed, right? Like we need to take care of our planet. And since real estate is the biggest contributor to the emissions that you mentioned, and we really need to address this. And so let's keep tracking this and see what other companies and developers come forward trying to make positive change.
Exactly.
All right. Today, let's welcome our guest. We have award-winning chef, Food Network champion, author of The Modern Tiffin, and columnist of Eco Kitchen for the Washington Post, Priyanka Naik. Priyanka, welcome to The Build Up.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're so so excited to speak with you today, not only about your very accomplished professional journey, but also about your real estate journey as a 2-time homeowner. So we're going to get into that today.
That's very exciting. Thanks so much for being here. You were born and raised in Staten Island, New York. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that experience was growing up, and how did you get your passion to cook?
Yeah, so yes, born and raised on the Forgotten Borough. We are still a borough, shockingly. But yeah, it was very interesting. I think most people didn't look like me growing up because I'm Indian, and, my parents are Indian and they immigrated here. And it was interesting because we were not embraced for our culture. In fact, we dealt with a lot of discrimination and racism and, things that most people shouldn't have to deal with, especially if you're in New York City, because normally New York City is known to be very diverse, but not Staten Island. And, as unfortunate as that was, I feel like that was a little bit of the driving force for me to be so in tune and aligned with my culture, because, we were made fun of being Indian or eating a certain type of food, bringing into school, or, they would just make fun of all aspects of us. And there's two paths two paths that can go down. One is you can try to assimilate into American culture as much as possible and sort of get away from your roots, or it can actually bring you much closer to your culture because you see comfort in it. And that's kind of the path that I think I went down. So for me, it was very important to have that culture instilled in me from being raised in kind of a household on Staten Island with my sisters and my parents. We were very sort of comfortable with being who we were at home, and no matter what happened on the outside, we always embraced our culture through food, especially at home. And we went to India every single year growing up. So to answer that question, it's like, I would say I have a very loaded answer to it, because it's not just like, oh, we had like a picket white fence and everything was great. And while my immediate family home was amazing, it wasn't necessarily as amazing on the outside growing up, just given our background and our culture and stuff.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that, that's probably was a tough time growing up and not always understanding why are kids so mean and like why and why is this happening? But I'm glad that you took the positive route from it and it made you better, not bitter. And so, it led you to build this passion for cooking, and now everyone knows you as Chef Priyanka. But as we can imagine, it didn't just happen overnight like anything worth having. So can you share a little bit about how you went from, building an initial passion for cooking in Staten Island to now having this amazing platform where you've done so much with it?
Yeah, so I think kind of tying into what we discussed before, I loved cooking and food because it was a way for us to stay close to our culture aside from language. So I learned my native language of Kannada before I learned English, even being raised here and growing up here. But food was the other way. So like my parents were very strict about and thoughtful about kind of everything we ate, the 3 meals a day that we ate. My mom packed our lunch every single day for school. And it wasn't just like a random sandwich. It was like, a complicated Indian dish that we're like packing into like a lunchbox and taking. And so for me, it was a very cool way to stay in touch with my culture. And I actually considered going to culinary school, after high school when the college representatives come in, and I was like, oh, I want to meet with, the Culinary Institute of America and Johnson & Wales, and I was really interested in going. But then they were like, well, you have to butcher an animal and cook it and eat it and, do all the things that is standard in culinary school. And I grew up vegetarian, so I was like, well, that's a no for me. And also it wasn't why I loved to cook. It was the reason why I loved to cook was because it was just a creative, fun process that also tied in my culture in a way that everyone needs food, right? Everyone needs to eat. So this was kind of my vehicle to do that. So when they told me that and there was no way around it, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And then I just continued teaching myself and watching tons of Food Network and YouTube videos and traveling a lot and just learning from not only my family, but from chefs and people around the world through my travels. And then that's how I started my blog, Chef Priyanka, in 2011 after I graduated college. So now I'm aging myself. And it started taking off from there. And this will come full circle. But at the time, I used Twitter to really get my name out there. I used Twitter to be like, hey, you know, Goya beans, I used your beans in this recipe that I made, and here's a link to it. And Twitter at the time was the only public social media platform where you can actually interact with brands. So I used that very heavily, got a lot of recognition. I started auditioning for Food Network shows. They had casting calls. I actually was rejected a lot because they were like, well, you know, the network's not really ready for a vegetarian cook. And, you know, we don't really know what your brand is. And so obviously I don't take rejection very well. And I was like, if they had a legitimate reason, I'd be like, sure, like I'll go work on it. The brand piece was completely legitimate, but the vegetarian thing was not. So after my I think 4th or 5th try of just auditioning and trying out, I finally got on the show Cooks versus Cons, which is similar to Chopped. I competed against, you know, other professional chefs, and I won, and I made purely vegetarian food at the time. So
Congrats.
Thanks. So it was kind of just a way for me to be like, okay, I'm now setting up the credibility for myself in this industry where I'm constantly rejected. And that's my way of showing, like, you don't need to take a traditional path and, you know, look a certain way to be considered a chef.
Right.
I love that. I find that very inspirational, right? Because there's always going to be rejection. It's about how you build yourself up from there. And the fact that you didn't even go to culinary school and you held your ground, you were self-taught. I thought that that's really wonderful and very inspirational for sure.
Thank you.
Of course. But, and you've developed this amazing brand, Chef Priyanka, like we mentioned. But I think today we kind of want to touch a little bit more on your real estate journey. And as you know, as a young woman, especially a young woman here in New York City, we find a lot of our buyers, and from our experience, a lot of just young people in general, they're just very intimidated by the process. It could be very overwhelming, right? And unless you have the right team and the right people behind you to even advise you, it could be very hard to break into real estate. So can you talk to us about your journey and what really inspired you to buy your first home?
Yeah, this was an interesting journey. I think there was a couple of things happening. One is I'm just the type of person that doesn't like to compromise on my preferences. And shockingly enough, I have very, you know, luxurious preferences that I like, and I can't always afford those preferences, right? Like most people, everything, you know, there's certain aspirational things you have in your life. But when I graduated school and I started working in Manhattan, I rented for 1 year in Midtown East. And my rent at the time, I mean, it was expensive for a studio. It probably sounds cheap now, but I think it was like $2,200 maybe for a pretty big studio with high ceilings and a galley kitchen and a view of the Chrysler building. So I was like, oh my God, it's so cool. And then after I rented for 1 year, I was like, you know, this isn't feeling right. Like, this doesn't make sense. I couldn't wrap my head around the concept of rent because it wasn't mine. And clearly I'm a possessive person. So I was like, I do not possess this apartment right now, and it doesn't make sense. And if I just keep renting, and the idea of also like moving multiple times, it was just not pleasant. So the real guidance I had were from my parents, and they were like, well, the only way you can get past this is you can commute from home. And
no,
right. We're fortunate enough to like live close enough where you can commute, but that means like, you know, you're sacrificing your lifestyle, your social life, privacy, whatever it may be. Or you can downgrade significantly and rent something, you know, much cheaper in an area that may not be as desirable for you in order to save. The whole objective was, how do we save enough for you to have enough capital of your own to put a down payment on and basically show a bank that, hey, I can get a mortgage, right? Without having gift money and all that. And you could do gift money and all that stuff. But I'm very prideful. And my dad was like, you know, we're happy to help, but if you don't want that, then these are your options. So I took the option of staying at home for almost 2 years. I commuted, but that wasn't just it, because even if you commute, there's other expenditures, right? There's food, there's social life, there's vacations. And at the time I was 23. So it's not like I was making six figures at the time. Like I wasn't making as much. So I had to be very conservative. So I lived at home, So I saved on rent. That's the checkbox one. The next checkbox was, okay, my social life. So what can I do to minimize expenditure here while still trying to, live a fun life? So I would do things where I would crash at my friends' places if we're like going out. So I'm not like spending on taxis coming home, and Uber wasn't as big then. So it's like, but you still take a taxi back to Staten Island. It's like $75. So then there was other things where it was like, okay, vacations that I took where I was very particular about what vacations I was taking and how I was spending my money. I wouldn't buy coffee on a daily basis. I would pack my lunch every day to work. And while these things sound silly, they really add up. Like a cup of coffee is what, $5? And if you're buying it one time a day, 5 days a week, that's $25, right? So those were the things I did for 2 years. And then I saved enough to then actually go back to the building that I was renting from. And I bought a different unit, like a studio alcove unit. And it was a total starter apartment. It was certainly not like, oh, this is my dream home. But I knew that if I was to get my foot through the door in real estate at this age and start building equity, this is what I can afford. Like, this is what I have to do. So that was my starter apartment. And I negotiated a pretty good deal. I actually got it for less than $500,000 at the time, which is insane, in Midtown East. And then I put in my own, some of my own money to renovate some of the things. So I did some capital improvements to it. So then when I sold it 7 years later, I made a pretty good amount of money on it.
Right.
That must have felt so good to go back to the building where you were renting and to purchase and, finally have that sense of ownership that you were looking for. That's such a important feeling, as self-driven people, to really have that, like, I did this myself. And that's so awesome. You did it in a relatively quick amount of time. I mean, you were willing to sacrifice for like the greater good. And I think a lot of people in our generation and others want that instant gratification. So they're not willing to make those sacrifices towards a greater goal. And that's why we see so many people perpetually renting forever, throwing so much more money than the $2,000 in rent, more like $4,000 or $5,000 a month. And they have nothing to show for it at the end of the day, and they're moving every 1 to 2 years and paying brokers fees and all this stuff. So, that's really awesome that you did that.
We've been talking a lot about this. I think, especially millennials and Gen Zs currently, there's an affordability crisis, right? Of housing currently. And I think a lot of times they don't really have that plan that you spoke about, right? And we always try to advise our clients to, you have to sit down, because if you're going to constantly look at the amount of down payment you need to do, you're going to, like Candice said, you're going to keep on renting, and you kind of like fall into like this whole, this pattern of just doing that. But the fact that like you had a plan and you were able to execute against it, I think that's admirable.
I think the best analogy I have for this, which I actually said it the other day, because I mentioned before, I'm very aspirational. There's like, if it was up to me, I'd get all the nicest things in the world, but I can't necessarily afford all those nicest things. However, I make myself a strategy like, okay, well, if I want X thing, I need to do Y. And so the best analogy I have is like, if you want to get a Mercedes-Benz, right, which is a very expensive car, why would I get the A class, which is literally like their first entry class? It's just to say, okay, I have a Mercedes.
Right.
When in reality, you may want an E-Class or an S-Class or a G-Wagon or whatever it is, which are very expensive. So if I want that G-Wagon, then what am I going to do for the next 2 years in order to get that G-Wagon? I'm not going to get an A-Class.
Right.
I'm going to build a plan to save and understand what is required, like how much money is required to get that, and then see, okay, this is the time I need to do it. It's like the same thing I would do for a house, right? Like that's what I did with my condo. I was like, okay, well, I need to live at home for 2 years. And while that may not be ideal, especially at that age, like I made all those sacrifices, but now all of my friends are not necessarily owning at my age, or they're dealing with these quote unquote high interest rates or whatever it may be, right? So I think it's what you want to sacrifice, and also making a plan for that longer term goal, that G-Wagon, basically.
Agreed.
So renting is A-Class, Mercedes, and G-Wagon is owning. Just want to make sure we're clear.
Nothing wrong with an A-Class, though. I do like the size of it. Small, compact.
So what were some of your fears though? Because you come across as very self-confident, and you had this plan and you did it, but I'm sure that you also had some fears going into purchasing. What were some of them, and how did you build up the confidence to actually execute on your plan?
I think there's always going to be a bit of fear, and if you don't have any sort of fear or nervousness when making big purchases, then something is wrong, right? Like, I think for me it was, okay, well, with rent, sometimes it seems like less of a commitment, right? Because it's like, oh, it's yearly, or sometimes people get 2-year rent. So after that year, if something happens, then I can just leave that place and not have to deal with it. With the mortgage, you're taking 30-year mortgages out, right? So it's like, okay, like I owe the bank.
It's a marriage.
Yeah. And so there is some fear in that, and just in terms of personal job security, because as a single woman, at the time, or, solo buyer, I didn't have another income to depend on at the time. I didn't have a spouse or a partner. I can maybe ask my parents or my sisters, but that wasn't the idea. So there's definitely a fear of like, okay, will I be able to, pay this and commit to this? And the thing is, I think where I was okay in that is that you're not necessarily stuck. I think what people many times think is, oh, okay, once you own, you're stuck. When the way I looked at it is, well, I have a consistent mortgage. It's not like rent where it's going to increase. If interest rates go down, I could refinance. It could be even lower. So the stability of having a mortgage, I think, made me feel comfortable. And then the fact that if I give myself a year or two in Manhattan, especially, property's always going to appreciate, I can always sell. So there is that advantage of having, whereas in rent, you can break your lease and you lose money, and then you don't have to pay going forward, but you don't have the advantage of making anything.
Right.
Whereas with owning, you have the advantage of potentially making something because you're building equity on that place.
Right. And what we were speaking about before about the down payment, that first purchase for anybody is the hardest, because unless you're getting a gift, you have to save that down payment, and there's no shortcut to that. So that's why the first purchase is the hardest. But what people don't always realize is that from there to upgrade or to buy multiple properties is much easier, because you leverage the equity you built and you upgrade, or like I said, you can buy an investment property. So you did that very well. But I think that what's interesting to us is that was seemed very natural progression for you, whereas for a lot of people, they don't even think of that. So for us, our question is, how did you know to do that? Or when did you realize that your property had appreciated enough for you to be able to make that next move?
There's a couple of things happening. One is I had been in that property for about, I think, 7 years at the time, and then obviously all through COVID. And as my chef career was, taking off, I was like, okay, I think I've outgrown this. Not because, I'm making so much more money. It wasn't about that. It was, I've matured out of this place because I felt that I needed a bigger kitchen, a more open kitchen. I needed a place where I feel like separation between the bedroom and the living area, because I had an alcove studio. So there was a personal feeling of, okay, I think I've grown out of this. There was also I was at a different stage in my career. It was obviously 7 years later. I'm making a different amount of money. I've saved a different amount of money. My whole life was different than it was 7 years prior. And then again, the real push were my parents, that they were like, if you don't sell now, it might become difficult to sell later given the trajectory of interest rates. And so
they're very smart.
Yeah.
They're right on time.
And so I was like, okay, well, I have the feeling that I feel like I need to, do something and make a move. And then my parents were like, they're the ones that were like, okay, we're lighting this fire under her butt to do this. And, that's the thing, that's where I feel grateful or lucky, because I know that people don't necessarily have, people like that in their life, or especially parents to do that. But with my parents, they are teaching us things that they may not have done or wish they would have done, or had done, whatever it is, teaching us the right way. So when I was in the process of being okay, I think this is good, because especially at the time in Manhattan, there were so many new developments, as you guys know, there was so much inventory. So I was like, okay, maybe I can actually afford the place that I actually like now, right? Not that I didn't like my place before, but I outgrew it. And that was the only thing I could afford at the time. And I think it's also being realistic, right? Again, like going back to the realism versus aspirational. Like, yeah, I saw a lot of apartments that were totally out of my price range, but I was like, okay, that's good to know this exists, maybe in a couple years.
For the next, is the next goal, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So then I just started making moves. And I think the one thing that at least I learned with having to sell and buy is you have to be very aggressive and on it yourself. Like, obviously you could have great brokers and like a support team like you guys, but there's also a lot of me in the background, like trying to do things and trying to,
create advantages.
Yeah, correct. And so it's very hands-on in that time period between selling and buying, and also like trying to lock in the interest rate. And, thank God that I did at the time, because my interest rate's very different than the way it is now. That doesn't mean it's unachievable. Like, my boyfriend just bought a condo now with these interest rates, and it's his first. And I was like guiding him through the whole process, because I was like, my parents helped me, but it's not like they attended every single meeting and every single thing. And like with him, I went to every single thing because I was like, I just did this, and I'm your age, so I can help you like go through this process. So it is definitely achievable.
No, that's great. And I think obviously timing was on your side. You bought your new condo during COVID or right after, correct? And you did lock in a really good interest rate, which is amazing, because as you know, actually like your carrying can double, because interest rates pretty much double from that. And so that's great on your side. But in terms of, your criteria, you obviously have high standards, like you said. And as a chef, I'm pretty sure, the kitchen is the focal point of your home. But what else do you look for when you're looking for a home?
I think I want something to feel open and homey, because I grew up in like a nice home on Staten Island where we had a very open, and still do have a very open floor plan, where like the kitchen is seamless to the rest of the house. And I clearly spent all of my time there. So I think aside from like a nice kitchen, it just has to feel open and connected to the rest of the house. And it also has to be, the way I look at it is if I'm at a certain price point now, the quality and the quality not only of the apartment, but of the building and the amenities, they all have to line up, because I looked at so many properties, and, the one thing I remember talking to Candice about is like some of the other kitchens, same price point as what I own now, but like it's a half size oven. And I'm like, excuse me, I need a full, and they're like, yeah, well, most people like
don't
order
cook
in and don't cook. I'm like, honey, you do not know me. But for me, it's more the value of it, right? Even if I'm ordering in and not cooking, I can't justify buying something that is the same price as another unit that is providing full size everything, same quality, like build is the same year. So I think for me, it's not only the openness, but it's the quality, it's the size of the building. I don't like huge buildings. I like more boutique-ish buildings, because then I feel like everyone knows each other. It's quieter. It's a more like, again,
community.
Yeah. It's like I want to live in Manhattan without Manhattan, but then I want to like see Manhattan. So it's like,
Well, you did make a good decision. Your apartment is beautiful with those views too.
Yeah, you also forgot to say you have a direct view of the Empire State Building.
Yes. View is important too, because I think because I like the openness, the brightness of an apartment really makes a difference. In my first condo that I owned, even though it was smaller, it had huge ceilings and it was very bright, and there were some things I couldn't forego in a place that I live in, because I want to come home and feel like, oh, like it's like nice and bright, and like now, and I'm a homebody, I should mention. So I like to stay at home, and if I'm going to stay at home, I need something nice to look at. So
makes perfect sense.
That's my mentality as well. I'm a super introvert, so my home needs to be like my little
oasis.
Yeah. Exactly.
We know that in addition to everything you express, sustainability and zero waste is also a very big part of what your value set and what's important to you. And the building that you did buy at View New York is a LEED certified building, which does speak to that other, criteria that is very important to you. But being sustainable in general, and especially in a place like New York City, is not easy. So what is some advice that you could give to our listeners in terms of what they can do in their apartment to become more sustainable?
Yeah, so I will say like that was another criteria in terms of my home search, which is like I would ask the, brokers or whoever was representing the sponsors or developers, like just if they had any insight on how these buildings are being built. So the View being LEED certified was a big thing for me because it would just go against my principles to be in some place that was not that.
Rated D for energy efficient.
Yeah, it just wouldn't make sense. I think there's a bunch of things I do that I think other people can easily incorporate into their day-to-day just to be more eco-friendly. The first is you can compost, which I talk about this all the time. I know you guys probably follow me, and whoever does follow me who's listening is like, I'm obsessed with composting, and it is possible even if you don't have a backyard or anything. Basically, I take all of my scraps and I freeze them, and then I take them to the Union Square Farmers Market and I compost there. And the reason why I freeze them is because I travel a lot and I can't have like gross compost scraps like sitting in my apartment. I don't have like a huge home or a backyard, so it'll smell. So I freeze it, so then it's just makes it more accessible. Like, okay, now I have this bag in the freezer, has all my scraps, and I just keep putting my compost in. And once it's full, I take it to the farmer's market to compost. So it's like very easily accessible. And the farmer's markets are all over the city. So you don't have to go to just Union Square. You could go literally anywhere that has a compost bin. So I would say that's the easiest thing. The other thing is just thinking about the supplies that you use in your home. So I try to get a lot of reusable supplies. So even the hand soap that I use, the brand is Jello with a G, and it's all like plant-based pods that you put in. It's a glass bottle and it's reusable. And another important factor about that is because we live in just like smaller apartments and condos and not huge homes, it's not like I could stack up like 50 bottles of something, right? So if you have a reusable bottle, then you're just using that one. You don't need any more and you just refill it. So I try to use a lot of reusable items. All of the paper products in my home are all bamboo. So like the paper towel, toilet paper, tissues, and they could be a little bit pricier. So there are different ways that I recommend people like get those. So Grove Collective is a really good sustainable product sourcer, and they have sales all the time. But also, like, if you don't even want to do that, just use, again, like what you have at home, which are kitchen towels and like rags. And I know this all sounds funny, but it makes a difference when instead of buying like rolls and rolls of toilet paper and paper towel, you could just use already what you have at home. So I use paper products, disposable ones, very sparingly. I also only run the dishwasher when it's full. And for me, that's not a problem since I cook all the time. But I notice that people don't do that, and I find that weird. And I'm like, okay, well, if you keep running it, then you're just using more soap, you're using more water. Like, just run it when it's full. And then also, I'm very particular about the AC in my apartment. So I'll really only put it on or use it when I absolutely need it, or, you know, if our dog is there or something. I don't want him sweating, but I'm very particular about that. And I know some people just like, these buildings are freezing, and I'm like, oh my God, besides the fact that I'm freezing, like, you're wasting so much energy. And then there's other, like, a lot of things in my home are like solar powered, like the remote control to my TV is solar powered. I have this like solar powered charger that you could just stick on the window. So there's a lot of like different small things you could do to be more and just saving water. I think like I boil vegetables and stuff all the time. Instead of throwing that water down the drain, you could strain it, cool it, and then water your house plants. Just make sure there's no salt in it. But those are just small things you could do to minimize waste.
Yeah. It's admirable. And I think we all need to, especially with climate, the climate change and the things we've been experiencing, definitely. And we're sure our listeners would appreciate those insights as well. And given your exposure to real estate so far, it seems you're very educated on the process. What do you see for your real estate portfolio in the future?
I've actually been thinking about this more recently, but I think it depends on also like what my life stages are, right? And I think that's another thing that people should consider when thinking about real estate. Like when I bought my first condo, it was okay having a studio because it's like, I'm not married, I don't have kids, I'm young, and it's fine to have this. But like, I don't recommend if you're married to someone to like have a studio or if you have kids or whatever. So I think what you buy and invest in should align with your life stages and your lifestyle. So for me, I think there's a couple of options. One is I can keep the current condo that I have at the View and as a 1-bedroom kind of investment property, and either keep it there, rent it out, and if I have a desire to move or own somewhere else, like outside of New York, that's a possibility. Or to keep that and also live in New York, but get a bigger place with my partner eventually in the future. The only way I think I would probably sell that property is if it's been 5 years or more and it's really appreciated in value, and like that will then put me in a place where, okay, the money that I quote unquote make on that condo by selling it will provide me the opportunity to get like a super lavish, like big condo for the life stage that I'm in. Then that's the only way I would sell it. But right now I kind of see it as being an investment property for me.
So wrapping up our interview, I think we always like to have some tips for our listeners, and you have such really great experience so far. What do you think were your biggest lessons, and what would you advise, homeowners, first-time homeowners, I would say?
I would say my biggest piece of advice, and something that I didn't necessarily do since the beginning, is try to think 5 years out, as difficult that may be. It's kind of like that interview question that you get asked on jobs, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But with real estate, I think it could be a very good question to ask yourself, because it aligns with everything we just talked about now, right? Like, okay, even if you don't have, a partner right now, or you're not living in the place that you want to live in, what could happen between the next 3 to 5 years that might change that? And how can you invest in yourself in order to get there? So I think thinking 5 years out at minimum, and also building a plan. So again, if you're not necessarily in a position in life where you want to be right now, that doesn't mean you can't be there in the next 3 to 5 years. So how do you build a plan to get that G-Wagon, right? Mm-hmm. So like everything takes planning. It's not going to happen unless you're, a trust fund baby, or like you're a super celebrity with tons of money. Things don't get handed to you. You have to make a plan for it. So I would say that's another important piece. But also, I would say the last thing is to step out of your comfort zone and take a little bit of risk, because at the end of the day, getting into like a big purchase like this there's always some risk involved, and should always make you feel a little bit like it should be a little nerve-wracking. But I think taking that risk can eventually really, really pay off. It's almost like people who do bets, but those are short term, right? This isn't necessarily a bet, but you are betting on the fact that you're going to continue growing in whether it's your career or your personal life, and you're investing in that. That's kind of the way I see in investing in real estate, because ultimately it is your home if you want it to be your home. So those are the 3 things I would recommend as my tips.
You could do our job. You're doing great. And where can our listeners find you if they want to look you up after this?
You could find me at Chef Priyanka across every part of the interwebs, because I'm an oversharer. So it's at Chef Priyanka on social, and then chefpriyanka.com is my website with all my recipes.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. This has been a fantastic and very informative conversation. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Priyanka, for such an enlightening conversation today. We enjoyed discussing with her real estate journey as well as her career, and we're sure our listeners are going to find it very enlightening as well.
For sure. We especially loved hearing about her passion for being more sustainable and living a zero waste lifestyle, which is something that I think we can all make positive changes to in our lives. And so that was really helpful to hear some of her tips in that area as well.
Agreed. It was a really great discussion, and we would like to thank our sponsor, Brown Harris Stevens. And of course, you can find us at tower.com and our Instagram @tower.
Until next week.
Thank you.